Listen to part of a letter written in the 2nd century by a Christian trying to explain the Christian way of life. He wrote, "The Christians are distinguished from other people, neither by country nor language nor the customs that they observe, for they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of people, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of human doctrines, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners, as people passing through. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry as do all others, they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all people and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are glorified. They are reviled and bless. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred." That was from a letter written by a Christian to an outsider early in the 1st century after Jesus, so about 130 AD. Now, in our letter from Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter now gets to some of the practicalities of how we're to live now that God has called us to belong to Jesus. So in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2, "Dear friends," he says, "I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." So all these two verses, they're summed up well with one of the Proverbs, chapter 4, verse 23, that above everything else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Above everything else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And so we are told to abstain from sinful desires. Keep far away from them, avoid them, don't ever indulge sinful desires. And so we know from this that some of our feelings, some of our longings, our desires are not right. They are wrong. They're not harmless. Your desires are what shape you, shape your character and shape your actions. And ungodly desires, we're told, wage war against your soul. They damage you in your deepest aspect, and they damage your relationship with God. Now, of course, this means that our desires can be controlled. We're not slaves to our passions. We can choose to restrain and redirect them in a godly way. And so this retraining of our desires will bear fruit in good lives. And so this way of life, it is good for us and it benefits those around us as well. And so ask yourself a few questions here. Am I above reproach? Do I have integrity? Do my private and public lives match up? Or is there inconsistency? Will people be attracted to Jesus because they know me? Or will they get a poor impression of Jesus because of me? Our hope is that they will come to faith in Jesus along with us in verse 12, and that by seeing your good deeds, they will glorify God on the day he visits us. And so we were urged back in chapter 1, verse 14, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. And that is why when you still live amongst the community that you were the same as, so these original Christians were called out of a pagan society to live a different way, but to remain in the society. The fact that you no longer have those same desires and you don't give in to them means that you're at risk of being accused of doing wrong by those who see that you're not like them anymore. So there's some alienation that comes from being different. That's why they're called foreigners and exiles. It's as if we don't belong anymore. And there will also be negative stereotypes. There was even the funny idea that in the early decades of Christianity, that Christians were actually cannibals, that they ate the flesh and blood of their leader, the Christ, and that Christians were incestuous, that brothers and sisters got married. And of course, this is just an outsider's misunderstanding of Christian language. And in a sense, you can't help these misunderstandings or that people jump to the wrong conclusions or assume the worst. But at the same time, we are not to do anything that gives valid reason for criticism, knowing that we are being watched by our society. And the hope is that as people carefully watch us over time, they'll become convinced that following Jesus is good, that it is right, that they'll see faith in Jesus lived out and see that it's true. Now, I watched my younger brother for almost 10 years before I was a Christian. And at the end of those years of watching him, I ended up wanting what he had. I saw that he had something good that I was missing out on. However, I've seen a report by McCrindle Research that says that 1 in 10 Australian adults doesn't personally know a Christian. So they can't name someone in their circles who is a follower of Jesus. And so how are they going to be able to see up close and personal how following Jesus makes a difference to life? Now, even if someone knows that you are a Christian, it can be very hard to convince them to follow Jesus one-to-one. But if they can see a Christian community in action and be part of it, and to see the way Christians relate to one another, the care, the patience, the giving of forgiveness when there is hurt caused, then Jesus begins to ring true and to look attractive. I know it made a world of difference to me to be a part of a church for the approximately 6 months that I was checking out Christianity before I became a Christian. And so I wasn't just reading the Bible on my own, but I was coming to church and seeing the way Christians treated one another and the way they treated me. And I remember talking to the minister one night, saying it was so nice that this community was so welcoming and I could experience Jesus with flesh and bones on, in effect, that the people are kind to me in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I said to him, look, I don't know if I'll ever be a Christian, but do you mind if I keep on coming to church, even if I'm not a Christian? And of course he said, keep coming. And it was just a couple of months later that I committed to following Jesus myself. And so this command in 1 Peter chapter 2 to live good lives, it's not just a personal command to you as an individual. It's not just about your own personal morality, but it's about our lives together. Live good lives together in a way that brings glory to God. And so that brings us to a few questions to consider. Are we a church that makes us glad to belong together? Are we a church that makes us think, it would do my friend so much good to be a part of this? They do not know what they're missing out on. What about, are we a church that people who visit go away thinking, wow, I want more of that. I can't wait to be back. And if your answer to any of those questions is no, well, how can you be a positive change? How can you make a difference to make things better in this community? The second part of our reading for today comes from 1 Peter 2, verses 13 to 17. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so that command to live good lives, when applied to how do we live under our human rulers, it looks like this. Submit yourselves to every human authority, verse 13. Now your mind might automatically then jump to the questions, but what about? Surely there are exceptions to this. Well, later in the letter we do get to the unjust suffering that Christians might experience under human leaders, especially as experienced by Jesus later in chapter 2. But for now, in these verses, we need to listen to what God is saying to us here in his word. And what we see is that loyalty to God does not mean that you have rebelled against human authority or that you should rebel against human authority. The fear at the time in the Roman Empire was that by their allegiance to another king, to Jesus, Christians were actually being disloyal to the emperor and that they were a negative influence in society because they saw themselves as distinct and separate. Peter ministered in the times of two emperors, Claudius and Nero, and these men were not exactly positive towards Christians. At best, they tolerated Christians, but at worst, they allowed persecution and directed persecution. And so Peter, we believe, was put to death in Rome under Emperor Nero. And yet Peter says that we are to submit to the emperor. Submit yourselves to the rulers who are not believers, who are immoral, who are indifferent to you, who even despise you. Submit to them, whether you agree with their policies or not. Submit to them, in verse 13, for the Lord's sake. Why for the Lord's sake? Well, verse 15, for it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. And so the doing good in this context is submitting to human authorities, submitting to our government, submitting to our health authorities, submitting to our police. And so we are free people, verse 16. Jesus has set us free from the penalty of sin, the guilt of sin, the power of sin, free from trying to earn merit with God, which is an impossible task, knowing that we are freely accepted by faith in Jesus. But this freedom doesn't mean that we are removed from society to live under a new king, turning our backs on living under other authorities. No, our human authorities have been set up by God. And so the governors in verse 14, people like Pontius Pilate, they are sent by, not by the emperor ultimately, but by God, sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. So God sets up human authorities, human government, to restrain evil, to prevent anarchy, to provide for law and order, to administer justice, to promote right, and to hinder wrong. And so we are to obey our human authorities. Obey them, except when commanded to sin. And so Paul lived out one of these times early in his ministry in Acts, when he was told by the Jewish religious leaders not to speak or teach in the name of Jesus. He told them in Acts chapter 4, "Which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we've seen and heard." And then he went out and continued preaching. He was arrested again by them and said to them, "Look, we must obey God rather than human beings." And then they flog him. They order him again not to speak in the name of Jesus. But at the end of chapter 5, we're told day after day, in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ. And so the principle is that we are to submit ourselves to every human authority, except when doing so would be to disobey God's command. But knowing that choice to disobey God's command, human orders, to disobey human authority is an exception, and that choosing to do this brings consequences. It comes with a cost. And so for Peter, the cost was jail and flogging, and eventually it was death. For a modern day example, we might look to, for example, China. So since 2018, one of the churches there has been disobeying what are really unacceptable laws by continuing to gather for worship and prayer and Bible study while technically being unregistered, and by continuing to witness openly in society to Jesus and to teach people who are under 18 of Jesus, so their own children, despite all of this being illegal. And so being registered in that context means having the government appoint church leaders and approve of them, scrutinize them for their ongoing approval, having video cameras installed in places of worship to be able to monitor all activity there. And the stance of that church to obey God rather than men means that many of their leaders and many church members have been imprisoned and are being closely watched. So this command to submit ourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority should see us going above and beyond what's required in our context here in Australia. So, for example, for us, what it might look like: paying your taxes and your rates on time and willingly, keeping to the speed limit, For any ministry to children and vulnerable people, getting the required Working with Children check and keeping it up to date, completing Creating Safe Ministries training and police checks if they're required. All of these things might personally inconvenience you and you think they're over the top and you might grumble about them. But submitting to the authorities in this way is good for wider society, and it's a form of loving our neighbour. And we are in a far better position than Peter's first readers. We're under a favourable political system. We have political representation with unprecedented personal access to our local members. We have many politicians who share our faith, or are at least positive towards the influence of Christian faith in society. We have access to media through which we can share our opinions. We can lobby and protest and vote. We have great privilege here, and we are not being persecuted. The New South Wales government has even listened to concerns of church leaders recently, enabling us to gather together regardless of whether or not we've been vaccinated, from the time that 80% of the state is double vaccinated, which will be about 5 weeks earlier than other sections of the community. So for other places like community sport and restaurants, they all have to wait until December, and yet churches from late October will be able to gather vaccinated and unvaccinated and partly vaccinated people. And so the church in New South Wales is well supported by our government. For the next week or two though, until the Monday after New South Wales reaches 80% double vaccinated against COVID, this church, along with many others in New South Wales and some in Temora as well, will not be gathering in person. I, along with our parish council, have written a letter outlining the reasons for this and the practicalities. So our reasoning is that we do not want to exclude people from church, whether they're unvaccinated or partly vaccinated, or they just can't document their vaccination status. We don't want to ask too much of our volunteers, our welcomers, who would then have to check vaccination status and turn people away from entry. We don't want to attract fines for potential non-compliance. And this is also on the recommendation of our regional bishop as well. And so when we do come back together in late October, we'll continue to abide by New South Wales government regulations, wearing our masks, checking in, sanitising, keeping density limits of 4 metres squared per person. This is how, for this time, we submit to our state government authorities.